Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of That Weems Guy. We have a couple of returning guests and some new blood here tonight, and we will go around and do our introductions. Then we'll tell you what we're going to talk about tonight. Up first, Mr. Hearne.
Hey, John Hearne here, retired law enforcement officer after 31 years, longtime range master staff instructor, owner of Two Pillars Training, have my own shingle out these days.
Wayne Dobbs.
I'm Wayne Dobbs. I am a retired police officer from the Dallas area. I worked for the Richardson Police for 25 years. Uh, Contracted overseas and in the United States for the State Department. I also work for Colt as an armor instructor. Work for Aimpoint now, managing the Western United States law enforcement territory. And I counted them up the other day, and I was shocked. I've been a firearms trainer for 44 years now.
There you go. And joining us tonight, making his That Weems Guy show debut, Mr. Bob Jewell. How are you doing, sir?
Hi, Lee. Bob Jewell. I live up in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm a kind of a local firearms instructor. Kind of a hobby. My full-time job, I just retired from it at the end of last year. Had a consulting business that I ran for about 25 years, helping companies do all kinds of different things. Range master certified instructor, and it's always been a hobby of mine, and it continues to be a couple times a month. I'm doing some classes.
All right. So this episode is going to be all about the balance between speed and accuracy. And to jump us off in that discussion, we're going to talk about the Bakersfield qual, which has came to public light in the shooting world about a year or so ago. And Bob has written an article on Mike Waidelich and the Bakersfield qual. And so, Bob, if you would tell us about your article, where people can find it, and just going into what you found out about Mr. Waidelich and the qualification.
Yeah, the article got published in the July issue of Concealed Carry Magazine, which is one of USCCA's publication. A nice magazine goes out to roughly around 300,000 people, I understand. 250, 300,000, always well done. It's not the first article I've done for them. They never call me and ask me to do an article. I just think of one and submit it to them. And they've turned a few down, but I've got lucky and they've done a couple. This one came about kind of interesting. I mean, I think all of us probably first, at least my first exposure to Mike Waidelich was a post that Greg Ellifritz put up. And it was actually an article written by Andy Stanford, who I didn't know at that time. I obviously have gotten to know, read a couple of his books by now, called, I believe it's called A Requiem to an Unsung Hero. And Andy had just learned within a day or two of writing that Mike Waidelich had passed away in April of 2021. And so Andy was kind of telling the story about Mike, and Greg published that on his website. I think that was the first time, and it just, something about it just caught my attention. The qualification, the story, yeah, it just, I kept reading it. I know Ken Hackathorn and Wilson did a video shooting it out in Idaho at Ken's place. I remember seeing that video, and I'm not sure that target was correct that they were using, but it was based on what Andy wrote. I learned later there was a little bit of adjustment to the target sizes. We could talk more about that. Then Andy actually wrote a second article about Mike in a magazine called Snub Noir. It's a snubby revolver website back, and he wrote that like in November of 2021. A little bit more detail about Mike, and in searching the internet, I found that article, and then I think then Dwayne Thomas, again a guy I didn't know anything about, wrote picked up Andy's article, the first one that he wrote called Requiem to an Unsung Hero, and wrote an article in Dylan's Blue Press around the fall of 2022 about it. And I went out and shot the qualification as it was outlined in Andy's article. I wrote down in June of 2022, and just kind of drew the circle and an oval on an IDPA target, and went out to the range and shot it. And I thought, dang, there's something about this that's catching my attention, right? And I shot it a few more times, and then I waited, believe it or not, almost to a year and a half later. I was doing a class with some advanced students, and I thought, I'm going to put this qualification up and let these students shoot it. That was around December of 2023, and see what their feedback is. And these are some good shooters, guys. I've spent some time with that come to a range on a Saturday morning for 2.5 hours to shoot from concealment. And I run them through some drills and run through some stuff, and they often bring some things they're working on, and we talk about it. I bring in some guest instructors every now and then, local police department guys, sometimes academy teachers. So yeah, it just kind of the qualification grew on me, and then I thought I want to learn more about Mike. You know, the articles just grabbed my attention, and so I started off with a call at Bakersfield, to Bakersfield Police Department. And the next thing you know, the next month and a half was nothing but phone calls from people, emails. Hey, I hear you're doing an article about Mike. I got something I want to share with you, or emails or text. It was really the process of writing the article, gathering up the information was actually more exciting than seeing the article published. Because the type of people I got to talk to, I mean, Dennis Tueller and Ken Hackathorn, and I think Wayne and I talked, I think John and I talked, Lee, you and I talked. I mean, officers that served out there. The current assistant chief at Bakersfield, father was an officer out there from, I believe, 75 into the late 80s. All the whole time Mike was out there. So, and that officer, his wife still is a part-time helper at the Bakersfield Police Department. So, I mean, I got some really interviews with some great people that knew Mike firsthand. And the stories I started to hear told me this was one unique guy. And he thought a lot about the qualification. He thought a lot about officers. He thought a lot about training them in such a way that their lives would be saved when they went out on the street. And, you know, we all know the current state of police firearms training, so we won't beat that up. And I hear it all the time here locally from some of the police departments I work with, though. So yeah, Mike was just a story that had to get told. And even though it had been told by Andy a couple times and by Dwayne, I felt like there was more. I wanted to add a more personal touch to it than just the shooting portion. Yeah, the article was really long. I got edited quite a bit by USCCA when I submitted it. It was amazing. But it was probably good editing. There were some things. Mike had been involved in Front Sight when Front Sight started out in California before it moved to Nevada. And I'd had a paragraph or two about that, and that got cut out. Now that was okay. I mean, the Front Sight story really that didn't add a whole lot to the mix, but. And then when I submitted it, usually if I submit an article, it could be a year before it gets published, because the way their magazines are published, each magazine typically has a topic, and if that article doesn't fit that topic, they're going to wait and put it in a magazine that does. And I mean, it wasn't a week after I submitted that article, they said it's going in the July issue, the very next one we're going to publish. And I think there's a guy at USCCA, I can't remember his name, but who knew the story of Mike Waidelich, and I think it caught their attention. So it got published much sooner than I thought it would get published. But
yeah, I believe
so it's in the
Steve
July
Hendricks.
issue.
Could it have been Steve Hendricks?
Wow, I wish I could remember the name.
Yeah, your recounting of how you started writing the article and you started getting the calls and the emails from people.
Yeah,
that's been one of the fun things about this show, especially when we get to do the episodes that we go back and we talk about somebody like this Mike Waidelich, or any of the other like original gun sight guys that we've had come on. And sometimes I get emails from people, listen, man, that guy was the range master when I took my 250, and they tell me some sort of personal story about them, or thank you for doing an episode on so and so. And that's really cool. And a lot of times I wish I could figure out a way to combine all of that into one show and put it out to everybody. But
well, I'm an engineer by background, so it's, first of all, I think this is great because my 5th grade English teacher gave me a C in composition, so this is my chance to retaliate against her by publishing a few articles. somebody that knows me said, "Why do you write these?" And I said, "That fifth grade teacher that gave me a C and told me I didn't know anything about English inspired me." So, yeah,
Well,
it was, to me, I wanted to lay out a timeline. And that was one of the hardest things about this article, was to try to put it in a timeline and understand when Mike came on board, when he was range master, how many times he was range master, officers that served with him, at what time were they serving with him. And I mean, I was laying it out on a spreadsheet trying to get it. And even after I submitted the article, there were things I learned afterwards that twisted the timeline around a little bit. But, you know, I also heard a lot of stories, but I decided I wouldn't put them in my article if I couldn't confirm them with somebody else. That's always kind of how I've been. I mean, the stories were really good, and Andy shared a couple in his articles. One of them about the LA FBI guys that came up to the range one day and were, you know, getting on him about the qualification, and I just could never confirm that story. So it's a great story, and I'm glad Andy put it in, and Andy felt strong about the guy who told him. I just couldn't confirm it, so I didn't put it in my article. It was a shame not to put some of that in, but I think Andy covered some of that in the 2 articles he wrote. So between Andy's articles, and Andy had email with Mike, Andy knew Mike, and they traded emails often before Mike passed away. You know, my regret is obviously I never met Mike and never got a chance to talk to him.
I also can commiserate with you. I was forced to write an essay my junior year in high school. And the topic of my essay was, once I graduated from high school, I would never set foot in the classroom again. And we see how well that's worked out for me.
Right.
I did run into my English teacher along about the time I was finishing my master's. And so, what are you doing? You know, Lee, what are you doing these days? Well,
You know,
you remember that paper? It was wrong.
The other thing I want to share is that, you know, my own personal journey, you know, I served in the military, the Marine Corps, got out in the 80s, put my guns away. That was a thing in the past. You know, then we had an incident in my family that wasn't good, and it made me start to think again. And, you know, I got a concealed carry permit when I lived in Pennsylvania in the 80s. But then in some other states where you couldn't conceal carry. Then I came to Ohio. Ohio didn't even have concealed carry when I came here. We didn't get concealed carry to 2004. I took my concealed carry class to get my license in 2005. You guys, I think, are all familiar with Tactical Defense Institute. That was kind of where I went after that class, you know, to get some more training. You know, became an NRA basic pistol instructor in 2008 because some people were asking me to, hey, would I be interested in teaching some concealed carry classes? And I did. I think my first formal kind of national instructor class was a Gabe Suarez class. There's a name you hardly hear anymore. Back in 2010, he came to Ohio, did a close quarters combat class. And but I share all this with you because kind of my history through my own training has kind of been what inspired me to even dig into this qualification a little bit and write this article. The one class that really was a breakthrough for me was in 2010. I got to go up and take a Todd Green class in Indianapolis, and a buddy of mine went up, and he knew about Todd. I didn't know anything about Todd. You know, we went up there and took that class, and I didn't know anything about his fast, you know, fast test. And at the end of the class, we shot a couple times during the class, but at the end of the class, I think I got a 10.22. I mean, I remember driving back to Cincinnati thinking, this gun isn't going to save my life. Who am I fooling? I'm wearing this thing. I got this plastic card, you know, I'm counting on, you know, 20 years ago military experience. Man, I was depressed when I was driving home from that class thinking, you know, I'm like a lot of people. I've strapped this thing on thinking it's going to save my life someday. And Todd Green's class really proved to me, you got to work. If you're going to do this and you're going to do it right, you got to work. So I started working. Todd came back to the Cincinnati area in 2012. And I went up to take that class, and I was shooting a red dot at that point. I shot iron sights when I was in Indianapolis back in 2011. And I think I was the only guy with a red dot in my class in 2012 in that class. Todd even was busting me about it. But I shot the fast at the end of the class, and I shot a 7.38, which didn't meet his standard of 7, because I blew a shot on that last 8-inch circle that I didn't need to blow. I shot it high, wasn't managing my recoil well. Todd came up to me after I shot that, and he said, "You were over 10 seconds a year ago in Indianapolis, weren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, how'd you remember that?" And he says, "Well, you and your buddy didn't do very well." He says, "You've knocked almost 3 seconds off, and you had every ability to shoot this in a 6.38, but I had that 1 second penalty." He said, "You've worked your tail off in the last year to make that kind of improvement." And I said, "I have. Your class really inspired me to do that." Then in 2013, I took a Dave Spalding class, knew Dave from TDI days. 2014 was my first Tom Gibbons class, combative pistol. I was writing down, I had the privilege of taking a private lesson with a guy named Scott Jelinski in 2017. I don't think too many people knew who Scott was at that point. He was in Virginia, and I happened to be visiting my in-laws in Maryland, and I'd heard about him, and I was having some struggles with my red dot, even though I'd been running it for about 5 years. And so I called him up out of the blue, and I said, "Would you do a private lesson?" He said, "Yeah, come down to the range and stay afterwards, have dinner with him and his wife." And 2018 is when I took my range master instructor class, and 2022 with Wayne, as we talked about, is when I took the advanced class. I try to take one class a year from somebody nationally. And that's kind of what's fueled my desire to write an article like this, but more importantly, to understand a qualification like this. 10 years ago, I wouldn't have cared. Now I take what I do seriously, and I try to pass that along to my students, and I know you guys do as well. That, I can't remember where I got this quote from, but I start off all my classes with it. You're carrying a highly consequential solution to a very narrowly defined problem. I think that's one of the best quotes I've ever heard. If you arm yourself, you're carrying a highly consequential solution to a very narrowly defined problem. Take it seriously. And that's how I've approached my own training, my own classes that I go to, and even my approach when I teach a class is we're gonna take this serious. We're gonna have fun, but we're gonna take what you're doing seriously, because, as Tom Gibbons says, that day may come and you may not know, you don't choose it, and you've got to be ready at that point. So what I saw in Mike's qualification was just one step further in that journey that started all the way back with, getting my concealed carry license in Ohio in 2025 or 2005. Sorry, that was a long-winded tirade, but
Well, John, I think it was you that said, most of the stuff in law enforcement firearms are driven either by pivotal events or influential people. And yeah, I think for the audience needs to understand there are roughly 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. There's no single law enforcement way of doing things. It's very regionalized. It's very agency specific. It may even be shift to shift and officer specific in some cases.
yeah.
And you get, it's so easy to fall into that trap of, let's get everybody qualified, because sometimes when qualified, I'm talking about passing the qualification course, not actually qualified to go out and carry a gun. Sometimes it takes so much energy and effort just to get the struggling people over that bar.
Yeah,
we don't have any time and energy left to actually delve into training our people and get them better. I
think all of you guys would agree that, having trained with Craig Douglas, that the force on force stuff, man, is the most valuable. Even this weekend in a class that I did, I was just using cardboard targets, but the student had to turn their back when I set up the target, so they didn't know who the good or bad guys were. And it was set up in a scenario, and then I had them turn around and respond to what they see. And even though they were cardboard targets, it just, most of the students responded poorly. I don't know how to say it any other way. I mean, and it gave us a great conversation. And even though we never fired a shot, in those two scenarios that we ran, the conversations were more valuable than any shots we could have fired. Trust me.
Yeah. You know, the beauty of the Bakersfield qual, in my opinion, is one, it is very telling. I mean, it tells you exactly where a person is skill wise. Two, it does that in a very easy to administer course of fire.
Right.
Three, it's very low round count, so it's very
Absolutely.
budget friendly. I mean, it's just amazing in what he accomplished in just 10 rounds. And Wayne, I think you feel like you had something you wanted to throw in there.
And
Well,
this, go ahead, Wayne.
it did that. It's low round count. It's easy to run. I can run Bakersfield myself in about 2 minutes. So even if you're just running one student at a time instead of trying to run the herd,
Yeah.
you can do it pretty simply by just sitting there taking the guy and working him back. There's little to criticize on it. I remember being a student in firearms instruction courses of one sort or another, where it was stopwatch and whistle. This state takes it back to the 70s and 80s and the 90s too. And one
Yeah.
thing I noticed is that there is a slack time that we don't factor in a lot of times on these time standards. And I have taken that Bakersfield course and run it true times off an electric timer, and then spotted a quarter of a second, because figuring that you've got a lag time or slack time with the
Right.
actual stopwatch operation and the whistle actuation. Plus, you know, you don't stop the stopwatch right on the shot. There's a bunch of error in there.
Yeah.
But even running it on the standards with as written with a timer, electronic timer.
Yeah.
There is only one spot on that course that is somewhat difficult to make it, and that's the very first one at 10 feet, two
Yeah.
shots in a second and a half from the holster. And
Yeah.
when you look at Bakersfield, and I remember the gear of the time,
Yeah.
and it was a probably not so well thought out thumb brake, a leather holster, not Kydex, not any of the super holster materials. So
Yeah.
you're all of a sudden you're getting that as a factor that's sickening it. Another thing is all of those holsters, or the majority of them back then for those courses at Bakersfield, were high ride, like a Bianchi or a Safariland thumb snap, and it had a 1911 in the holster.
Yeah.
So there's some things there that need to be considered. You talk about going concealed. Concealment certainly adds some time to it, but I have shot it enough now that what I've done with it is I've tried to make the times and the accuracy and usually do a good job. The other thing I've done, and this will be something if somebody's trying to learn it, is I'll go out there and shoot it as quickly as I can and guarantee center hits. And what I get time after time after time is 90 or 92 points, even with the time penalties. So
Yeah.
cool course, very useful, very easy to do, doesn't cost much, and you can do it in a hurry with them. You can say, hey, you can tell a unit or 3 units report to the range, boom, 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 knock them out. 5-10 minutes later, they're out of there.
Yeah, shooting it from concealed definitely adds a degree of difficulty versus shooting it from modern duty gear. I typically will throw out 99s from modern duty. I have trouble making that first time. But running it from concealed, sometimes I give up some time penalties. I don't give up points much, but I give up some time penalties. The first time I ever shot it concealed was against Mr. Hearne in a head-to-head challenge, and I think we all know how that came out. But I'm going to toss it to John for his comments.
My thoughts on the Bakersfield qualifications. I think that it is a masterful balance of speed and accuracy. In that, I think most of us here are kind of disgusted, frankly, with the relentless pursuit of speed without any regard for accuracy or accountability. So by using a part-time based system and then just merely giving you penalties if you don't make it, it really does allow you to pass the qualification because you can shoot super accurate and you give up a little bit of time, or you can skin the smoke wagon and get the hits there where it needs to be. I found it really useful, kind of as a means of keeping everybody honest. When I was wrapping up my last year, so I think ever since it came out, whenever I did my training with my folks, is we would shoot the Bakersfield qual. I'd shoot it first as far as that stuff goes. And we talked, we scored it as a group, so we were calling out scores and stuff like that. So when you work in that environment where everybody knows exactly how you're shooting, it encourages people to practice on their own in a way that a lot of stuff won't. Every once in a while, my guys would actually get from duty gear. I had a guy, get the first stage clean. 1.5 for the 2 rounds is awesome. The other thing that I did, and we plan to talk about a little bit later, is I just ended up using a version with a 6-inch down zero, and then the appropriate oval. And when you're trying to, reliably hit that 6-inch circle, you can figure out a lot. We ran
Yeah.
this cold at the cognitive conclave as well. So the Bakersfield overall is just a wonderful way to balance what we need. At a certain point, you're fast enough. It's like, how well can you hit? And everybody how's this? Everybody pays lip service like, well, the target is smaller. Yes, it is, and most people don't appreciate. Like, for instance, going from the 7-inch circle to like a standard 8-inch circle, you're only shooting at 75% of that.
Yeah.
And it's those subtle changes as far as the 7-inch circle, giving a little bit of grace for the bigger oval, that makes it so useful. If you just showed up to the range and shot Bakersfield in 5-yard roundup, you would have had a pretty good practice session, and you know exactly where you stand and what you need to work on.
And amen on that.
Yeah. I had a student take one of my classes and right after learning Bakersfield, and we ran it in that class. And I don't want to give away the agency here. The student went to the sheriff in the county in which he lived and told the sheriff all about it. And the sheriff mandated, well, all of my people will now shoot this once a month. And there's an indoor range in that county,
Yeah.
and once a month they have to go to that indoor range and shoot the Bakersfield qual, and they record all their times and everything. And then I don't know what follow-up training the guys are getting to help improve, or if you're just going to have to go do this.
Yeah.
I just happened to be back in that area teaching, and I was teaching in that indoor range after they've been at this for a couple of months. And I walked out into the lobby on a class break, and there were 2 or 3 deputies standing there with a shell-shocked look on their face, like they couldn't believe. And so I walked over to the counter, and one of the guys recognized me, and he slid me the notebook and opened it up, and I was seeing all the scores where other people were recording the scores each month. Like, oh, this is brutal.
Yeah.
This is, but I sure hope they're doing like something like taking these and like, okay, Bob, here's how we get you
Yeah.
better here and everything, and that there's not just demoralizing their troops on an institutional basis.
Yeah.
But it's just, if I were king of the world, of the law enforcement world, at least once a month, personnel will be summoned to shoot the Bakersfield qual cold. Well, no preparation, whatever. Like, Wayne, walk out here to the range and shoot. You're up. And we shoot it. And if you couldn't shoot whatever we'd set to be our passing score is, all right, well, you're not on shift until you report to the range, and we get you up to that speed.
Yeah.
And just make people, hold people, I don't think make is the right word, hold people accountable to that. And this is the deadly force thing is, it's not trivial. And I think everybody listening to the show is going to understand that.
Yeah.
It's so important to keep our people at a skill level in which they can perform on demand.
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't like write report. We don't have time to go look at the code book and see what the elements of the crime were before we write the report. Like, when it comes to using deadly force, it's a now. You got to be able to perform.
Well, here's one of the things
recency
plays a huge role in that. Sorry, Bob John had something he wanted to
Go ahead,
throw
John.
in.
So I would be remiss if I did not point out that the late great Pat Rogers did point out that learning only occurs after demoralizing failure. So sometimes demoralizing failure is absolutely necessary. What the audience may not appreciate is how low law enforcement standards have sunk. There was a guy, I found him on YouTube. He was going around and shooting the various state post courses, right? So I haven't watched all the videos, but the most depressing one I've seen so far was Illinois. In Illinois, you stand at 5 yards from the target, so 5 yards, right? And you have to hit a piece of legal paper, which is 8.5 by 14. They will give you 6 seconds to draw and fire those 2 rounds. That is such a standard, utterly removed from reality, that it shouldn't even be taken seriously. but that is the standard that's been set by the state. And that's why qualification, the standards matter so much. It's not what the 100% is. Whatever your passing standard is the minimum acceptable amount of skill you will allow your people to walk around with. And the ugly truth is, a lot of people were walking around with not very much skill at all. I mean, I'm not sure how many rounds I could get into a piece of, legal paper in 6 seconds. It would probably be all the ones in the gun would be my best guess. But that's the standards that that we're contrasting the Bakersfield against.
Yeah. Yeah. Who would think in a podcast in 2024, the topic of the podcast would be a police qualification? Right.
From the 1970s.
Learning how to shoot, speed and accuracy. You would think the conversation would be based around, a police qualification from 1970s.
Wayne, did you have something?
I was just thinking that, experimenting with it, playing with it. I've been through 2 Justin Dial classes that I hosted in Dallas, and Justin is probably one of the deepest thinkers and most intelligent people I have ever been around in any realm, and certainly in the firearms realm. And Justin likes Bakersfield a lot. And one of the things he does with Bakersfield that for a few minutes you really hate him is he makes you shoot it one-handed. And one-handed Bakersfield, strong hand only, is a real eye-opener. On the reload, you get to use your offhand to do the reload, but nonetheless, shooting Bakersfield one-handed is a true eye-opener too. And if you can sit there and stay, if you're a 99 shooter, if you can shoot a 90 or an 85, you're pretty good.
Yeah.
And I don't know if what Waidelich did with one-handed shooting. We know that one-handed shooting, especially in law enforcement, is extremely important. Probably half of the shooting encounters you'll see will at least start one-handed shooting because, the other hands are busy or they perceive that somebody's so close. But that's one of the things that you can do that's a variation on it. The other recency thing is I think we completely overlook it, except for a few people that talk about it on a regular basis, like Tom Gibbons, is the very best operational people in the world, firearms wise, in history or now, are all doing something every week live fire. Like SIS at Los Angeles. It is not a requirement, but it is a practice and a custom that they all go and shoot bonus every week. And if you haven't shot bonus, that's 40 rounds of pretty significantly tough shooting, especially in a couple of phases. Going back into history, Wild Bill Hickok, he shot 10 rounds every day because he carried 1851 Navies that environmentally were horribly unreliable once things got moist, either humidity or water wise. So every day he would fire 5 rounds out of one Navy and clean it and reload, put a fresh load on it, and 5 rounds with the other one. And he was pretty well known as a pretty solid pistol shooter. So whatever it is, recency is probably the most important thing you do, as long as you're doing it right. And 5-yard roundup or Bakersfield or Justin Dial's prep time. There's just a whole ton of 10-round things you can do, and you don't have to do the same thing every week. But I submit that if everybody was doing 10 rounds a week of quality practice, we would see amazing results and changes in law enforcement performance.
Yeah. Yeah.
John, didn't you get some information from a researcher that was showing something like a 2-week layoff and there was a certain drop in skill?
So there have been several attempts at that. I know Colonel Bob Young when he was in charge of the Marine Fast Units, had crunched some numbers. And especially if you have a very high level of skill, it does drop off very abruptly, especially for the pointing into the spear. There is supposedly a JSOC study that is not available to the public that looked at a very high-end performing unit. And what they found was their minimum to keep their skills up were 50 rounds a week, right? They could go to 100 rounds every other week, and it was almost the same. But no other combination or frequency would work out. So it wasn't like you could fire 400 rounds once a month. It was either 50 rounds a week or 100 rounds every other week. That was almost as good. And to nerd out for a second, we see that, the training intervals get really, really important. If you want to push it out even further, I really, live fire at least once a month. And if you have to miss 1 month, that's fine. But just the performance gap between 2 months and 3 months of layoff, and quite honestly, a lot of your high end law enforcement units brag that they train every quarter. Well, the problem with training every quarter is that's every 3 months. So they're probably okay for 2 of those months. But if you get into the gunfight, that's 3 months, more than 2 months out, you're going to see a dramatic drop in performance when it comes to that. That's just the tax of recency you have to pay.
And to put that in perspective, and I'll come back to you in just a second, Bob. Put that in perspective. In Georgia, the way our regs and rules are written, I could qualify in January of a calendar year on a 30-round qualification course that right now allows me to miss 6 times and still be able to qualify. Like miss the target, hit nothing but the berm 6 times and still be able to qualify, but make those other 24 shots as a 10-point hit. We are in the process of changing the state course. But as it stands currently, I could do that. I would not have to touch a gun again until December of the following calendar year. And so legally, and according to the rules, I could go all 24 months between the times that I actually draw a gun and shoot, and the state would still consider me to be qualified to carry that firearm. And that's scary. Bob, I think you had a point you wanted to throw in.
Well, I just wanted to mention, I don't think we'd mentioned it yet, but just kind of put a bracket on the conversation. This qualification that we're talking about is still being used at Bakersfield today. So, so this just doesn't sound like a big history lesson here. It's still being used. The only thing different, like I said, they're using turning targets and they've adjusted the times for those turning targets. I think we could have a debate about it, how valuable turning targets are or not. But anyways, the one thing that was so frustrating to me about this article is I really wanted to know how Mike came up with this qualification. And I wondered, and John and I talked about this a little bit, had he been influenced by Gunsight? He went to Gunsight for the first time in 1976. He was a range master already at Bakersfield at 75, and the current assistant chief's father confirmed that they were using the qualification in 75. So my thought was maybe he got it from Gunsight, but in fact, it was already in play before Mike went to Gunsight. Now, John and I, and John, you step in here, but the 250 target looks really similar, doesn't it?
It does. I was because it was where we were talking. I was having this conversation with you in my office, and I actually have my clean school drill target from Gunsight up on the wall, framed as it should be, with a picture of the colonel. And we're sitting there discussing the dimensions. I'm like, hold on a second. And I got up, and literally, I think that the secondary scoring zone on the Gunsight school zone is like 9.5 by 13. It's that oval is remarkably similar. The particular model I shot was in 2001, has an 8-inch circle high in that, but those dimensions seem to be hitting the right spot. I think it just comes down to that's reality. When you give people a silhouette, literally the entire silhouette scores as a hit. The entire Coke bottle and the FBI qual or anything like that. It's simply not reflective of reality. And I think that our best gunfighters, our best qualifications, our best trainings are simply a recognition of this is reality. This is the world as it is. We're not going to sugarcoat anything. We're simply going to deal with it and move on. And I think that this course came from reality.
And Mike was all about saving officers' lives out on the street. I mean, Paul Trent was one of the officers that I interviewed, and he stayed a good friend of Mike's for years. Actually, has the last gun that Mike carried, which was, I think, a Glock 22. He told me, but Paul went through the academy. He wasn't that good of a shooter. Mike made him a good shooter. I mean, Paul was out on the street 2 days after his graduation with his field training officer when they got in a gunfight that night. And he said everything, everything Mike taught me came into play at that very moment. And because of that, him and Mike stayed really, really close. And Paul Trent went out to Gunsight quite a bit. There was a picture that didn't get in the article of Mike and Jeff Cooper and Paul Trent. But Paul was just one of those officers that had a high respect for him. One of the things that Paul told me about Mike is Mike kept great data on all the officers that shot it. the ones that had to come back. I mean, he put a spreadsheet together before spreadsheets were even available and tracked it. And when there was a shooting out on the streets, you know, Mike would get out of his house and go out there and be counting all the shells and want to know how many rounds were fired. And one of the stories Paul Trent told me was there was a shooting one night, and Mike showed up. It was like midnight, and I guess the second officer that showed up to this incident unloaded his magazine, and Mike just lit into the guy and said, "Hey, where did you learn to just go out there and unload your magazine? I mean, you're throwing off all my good numbers by unloading a magazine that you didn't need to unload." And that's how intense he was. That, you know, how many range masters do you know would get up at midnight and go out to a shooting and be collecting the data and knowing the officers involved and knowing how they shoot on the qualification and putting that together and getting on the officers that went out there and just started randomly firing shots, because I'm sure that's not what Mike was teaching.
I would say in 2024, some organizations expressly forbid that. So that's
I was about to say the same thing, John. I'm all over the U.S. west of the Mississippi for work at firearms training units, and that's one of the little things that once I get to talking to them, I'll ask them is, are you guys asking if they attend any scenes is completely, that's a 100% no everywhere you go. Most of them, and when I say most, I'm going to say 85 or 90%, are not even furnished data from the OIS incidents for them to look at and to test against their training.
Yeah. So one of the things that changed as a result of that, I gotta go back and look at my notes to remember the year, but on the reload, which is stage 3, Mike didn't do that as a slide lock or emergency reload when they first started the qual, but then they had an incident out on the street when the officer went to slide lock and froze, and Mike was out there that night and heard the story and immediately came back and said, "We're changing that on the range." And I think it was around, I was looking back at my notes, Jim Ramos was it was 2006. Jim Ramos was the current range master, and they changed it. They changed it to they went to a slide lock instead of a non-slide lock, or instead of a tactical reload, they went to a slide lock, and they're still running it that way today. You know, and that came off of an OIS. So,
you know, that's the only part of the course of Bakersfield that I have a little bit of question about, and that is the way I've been told it's to be run, and I don't think I'm wrong, is draw and fire 2 shots and conduct a reload, whether it's slide lock or emergency or speed, whatever, it doesn't really matter. Yeah. I get real not wound up, but I think it's a really bad practice to teach people to draw and work right into a slide lock reload. I either build in more rounds or do it from ready, which is, everybody has been through Tom's classes knows that all your reload phases of a qual are run from a ready position.
Yeah.
Before Lee says it, I'll point out the other thing about doing the reloads that way is it's a great example to interleave your skills. I don't think people realized what interleaving did from a motor program learning, but it really is valuable. You know, one of the best ways to figure out whether you know how to do something is to interrupt you doing the process. So just the fact that you have to shoot the 2 rounds, 100% on the reload, then immediately transition back to shooting. I mean, how many times do we see people miss that first shot after the reload? And it's because the shot process is not down solidly. So while it's not ideal from the standpoint of interleaving the skills, as well as making sure you have a recent reload in there and keeping it to 10 rounds, it's a pretty good compromise.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wayne, I'm in agreement with you to a certain degree. And you and I had that conversation a long time ago about the fast. And I fell into that until I got to studying the concept of interleaving. And I think the more you can put more skills you can make someone cycle through in a single exercise, the better off we are. We just have to make sure that we are drawing the distinction between this is a drill, this isn't you know, this isn't something we're going to actually be doing in the field necessarily. And that's just got to be one part of it. You actually, you go and run scenarios,
Yeah.
other things, so that the people aren't firing 2 rounds and immediately starting to perform a reload. You don't want it to
Mhm.
get wrote into that. You want to write the motor program that you draw to reload and fire. Todd Green, I always stress to people, do not practice the fast. This is
Mhm.
an occasional test
Yeah.
to see where you are. And I
Yes.
think as long as we stay with that in mind, I think we're fine. Um,
And I would treat the
I've been looking at,
Bakersfield qual the same way.
yeah, I've been looking at
You don't go practice
yeah, I've been looking at some studies from some other athletic
it.
things like basketball, and they're showing, actually learning, that the guys that do shoot arounds from running to various spots on the court and getting fed the ball and shooting and practicing versus the guy that goes and does 10 from this spot, 10 from this spot, 10 from the next spot and everything. The guy that's doing it randomly and is having to cycle through all of the shots at the different plays that more replicates gameplay are doing better on the court. Here's another thing for all you guys that like to go do it over and over and over and over and over again. Do you get that magic run you can put on Instagram? The first through 2 free throws in practice are more indicative, whichever way you say it, of your game performance than say shooting 23 free throws in practice. Whatever your percentage is on that first two is going to match up. So it's
So
what
that
you can do
means,
cold and on demand, guys.
Yeah. Yeah.
so does that mean O'Neal never hit his first 2 free throws in practice?
Well, he didn't really
I'd have
have to.
fired that guy. I would have, if I was a coach, I would have never put up with leaving points on the table like he did,
Yeah.
because he
I
got
think
fouled constantly.
It makes some good YouTube videos. So
It looked like
yeah.
you shooting him out of a slingshot at the backboard.
All
just
right, Bob.
just just so all the listeners, because we're talking about these stages. Stage 3 is the reload stage. That's shot at 30 feet. It's you start with 2 rounds in your gun. So fire 2, slide lock, reload, fire 2. I believe 6 seconds for that. So just so everybody's got kind of a sense of what that stage is. That's not a stage, Wayne, that I'm usually doing okay. I'm over 5. I'm between 5 and 6. That's just, I just don't work on 2-second reloads. But the time on that's fine. The final stage out at 60 feet, which is 2 shots in 4 seconds, that's the stage that I see people blow a lot.
That's
They
easiest
shoot
stage of
that
the
too
whole thing.
quick.
Yeah.
They shoot it too
That's a
quick.
gimme.
Yeah. I mean, almost every guy in including my times, are usually like 2.7. And I sit there, if I miss one, I'm like, dang, I had 4 seconds to do that. Why didn't I take it?
I think that's part of the brilliance there is that he recognized that the close range problem is different than the long problem. And just like, Tom is really adamant you have to learn the
Yeah.
different shooting cadences. That's built right in there. And I can't tell you how many times my people always struggle. I think the hardest stage is the first one because it's the 2 rounds, 1.5. And then the other struggle is just to use all the time at the last stage to get
Right.
the hits in there. And especially when you're running the 6-inch version of the target, you definitely have to use most of that 4 seconds to make sure that they are in there. But
Yeah.
it is a great reminder in 10 rounds that I have to have very, very distinct shooting cadences. It's not, it's in the literature if you look at it, but I think it's important that when we talk about basing this on reality, we shoot this at particular distances. There was an explanation in the course. Why are we at 10 feet? Because no one should be closer than that.
Yeah.
Why are we at 20 feet? The length of a car. Why are we at 30 feet from the curb to the front door? And then finally, why are we at 60 feet from the opposite curb to the front door? Okay, this is the real world problems, especially of a more, a combination, rural and, urban department dealing with people coming out of the house, shooting at them, dealing with traffic stops. Again, they're not, modeling their training on how they wish things were. They're modeling their training on the way things are.
Mhm.
Yeah, those explanations from Mike were excellent. And were a big part of what he told the officers at the academy. Those weren't randomly selected distances. So
And you can tell about the success rate of the program, and not just, I'm sure it's not just Bakersfield. Bakersfield's a little snapshot of their program,
right.
but a lot of people don't know what Bakersfield was called by LA. And LAPD and LA sheriffs, they said they called Bakersfield the place that LA bad guys go to die, because that was what was happening to them when they went up there and took on BPD.
Well, with
And
an
to a
80,
lesser extent, Hearne County, because that's another operation that knew Mike fairly well, and there was a lot of cross-pollination there.
yeah, an 85% hit rate, and Mike tracked that intensely. I'm just sorry I couldn't get my hands on that data, because I would have loved to have been able to put that data in the article. You know, we know 1 year, about a year after the qualification went into place at the academy. So I'm going to say this is probably around 1976 or 77. Bakersfield hit rate that year in 8 incidents was 85%.
Mm-hmm.
And Wayne, I remember the first time I ever remember talking to you, I think was about some department in Arkansas that I'd read about that had like some high hit rate compared to
No,
like the national average. And if I go back a couple of years ago to some emails you and I traded, I think for the very first time, I was asking you about, you know, what are they doing? You know, why are they so high compared? And of course, that's changed at Bakersfield. Obviously, I don't even know if anybody tracks that number anymore, sadly.
well, that department if we're talking about the same one, that was Garland, Texas, which
Oh,
is
I'm sorry,
Garland,
outside
Richardson, and
Dallas.
Plano shared an academy. And early 90s, Garland sponsored Mid-South Institute to come in
Correct.
and we did a 3-day, 3,000 round pistol training package. And they put everybody in their department through the package, not the Mid-South, but they, trained the trainer kind of delivery,
Yeah.
and sustained it and made sure that there was plenty of ammo. Everybody was carrying a Glock 22, and they went into a period of, I think, 16 or 18 months. They had 24 officer involved shootings. This is a town of 235,000.
Mm-hmm.
And they shot at 93%. They had, of those 24, they had 22 dead suspects, 2 wounded. But what that was is, if you look at it, it was shooting 3 and 6 inch dots at 3, 5, and 7 and 10 yards at operational speeds, and drilling it into where people understood that a hit on the dot is a hit, and a hit that's not on the dot is a miss, and building a culture there, and building a mental framework of what the proper execution was, and it worked like a champ. It was astonishing how well it worked.
You know, that was one of my takeaways from the time I spent with Todd Green. I used to get mad at how small targets he'd have us shoot in his class. But, you know, still today, I put those 1 inch and 2 inch circles up when I'm at an indoor range and not able to draw from concealment, and just working on fundamentals. And, you know, that was driven by, into me by Todd. You know, just if you're going to practice on indoor range, you're working on marksmanship, work on small targets, because it's kind of like the professional golfer that puts a green in his backyard and makes the hole only 2 inches instead of whatever the regulation size is. So he practices on a smaller hole, and then when you get out to the golf course, the regulation hole looks huge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Mike served as range master twice. That was hard to confirm for a long time when I was putting the article together. So the first time was 75 to 80. They'd already transitioned over from revolvers at that point. The Smith & Wesson Model 59s was their first semi-automatic gun. By the time Mike was range master, they were shooting 1911s, I believe. Then he got into kind of an issue with a senior officer and got canned from being range master and had to go back out on the street, but came back in from 84 to 96 and served another 12 years as range master. His first stint was 5 years, and then his second stint was 12 years. So, I was able to confirm that, put that in the article. Mike was a Green Beret, and he was respectful, but a senior officer called one of his officers in for some reason, and Mike felt he should be in the office. If you're gonna, I don't know if it was a disciplinary issue, but Mike went and said, "Hey, I should be in this meeting too." And the guy didn't like Mike saying that, so Mike got kicked off being range master for 4 years until he came back in 84. You know, the
Yeah.
other thing about Mike is he excelled in a lot of stuff. I learned he was a poker. He got to play in whatever the big poker tournament is in Las Vegas. Um, he um, he got involved in chess somehow and got some grandmaster rating. He was a big 3-gun shooter when Soldier of Fortune put 3 guns matches together. Mike was big. His wife went out with him and would do most of the scoring. And um, people that knew him just said, hey, no matter what he did, he was always going to do it the best way he could do it. Right. And that's why I titled the article "The Pursuit of Excellence," because everybody that talked to him, that knew him, that I talked to, that's the word excellence. Nobody really used that word, but that's the word that was coming out every time you talk to people. Right. Not a weird perfectionist, because sometimes people that pursue excellence can get a little bit overboard with their perfectionism attitude, but Mike just wanted to do it the best way he could do it, and then wanted to be able to teach others. A perfect Green Beret for sure. And he found a home there. When he went to Gunsight, I think I wrote in the article that the first trip to Gunsight he made, he stayed out in the campgrounds, and Colonel Cooper came out to meet everybody that was at the campgrounds and bring them over to show them the range facilities. And that was Mike's first introduction to Colonel Cooper. And he was out there to take the 250 class. He was sitting in the 250 class, and Colonel Cooper announced that Mike was going to be the range master for the class. So I think he has the distinction of being the only Gunsight range master who had not attended a class before he was range. He'd gone out there to attend his first class and became the range master in the very first class he attended. Him and Jeff Cooper just hit it off and stayed friends for a long time, and a lot of conversations. Mike, I think, influenced some of the things Cooper was doing, and I know Colonel Cooper, and so that history was new information to me too. And again, I couldn't find a lot of other people that were out other than Ken Hackathorn. I talked to Dennis Tueller. Dennis Tueller was out at Gunsight when Mike was out there. He said, Mike would always go off on a picnic table at lunch by himself and be reading a book, and he wasn't standoffish. You could go over and talk to him, but he just kind of liked being at a picnic table and reading a book and drinking a beer. And the drinking the beer part caught my attention. So John, maybe you can share a little about the drinking the beer thing at Gunsight.
Nothing particular. I just know that the way they used to run it was that anytime your gun ran empty, that was a case of beer.
Yeah.
I was always told that was for the instructors to drink, as far as that stuff goes. But I think that it's important, and I think Lee's probably done a better job of this than most, is appreciating the deep history. Is that this was a small community out there, right? And one of the things that you mentioned is that Paul Trent had basically had the Gunsight experience before Waidelich could even gone to Gunsight. Why? Because they had been figuring out what actually worked. Going to the leather slaps, to the development of the Southwest Combat Pistol League. I remember when I interviewed Bill Jeans, the way that they got that information was they actually had 2 reserve officers who were shooters in the Southwest Combat Pistol League. They saw what they were doing on the range. They're like, holy crap, we need to know how to do this stuff. Please teach us. So I think it really is important to recognize what a small community that was, that allowed the genesis of the shooting industry that we have now. There's that famous quote that we're standing on the shoulders of giants. But the problem is nowadays is that most people don't realize that. They think that we've always known all this stuff, and they certainly don't know who the giants are. So I appreciate it when we go back and we revisit these guys. I think one of the things that Andy had mentioned in my conversation we had is that how influential those Soldier of Fortune 3-gun matches were. And if I believe, Waidelich was one of the range masters. He was running that competition event. Listener man knows, but Tom shot in Soldier of Fortune 3-gun back in the day, because that was the high-end shooting stuff when it comes to this. So again, I think it's really cool how all this stuff is very, very connected. And I suspect that when Waidelich showed up to Gunsight, Jeff Cooper knew who he was. He didn't randomly pick some dude. He probably had a reputation that he was able to tap into. I just think it's really interesting to appreciate how deep Cooper's reach was as far as trying to figure out the solution to these problems. And I think Wayne touched on this, the idea that this stuff is good enough for operational speed, and probably maybe an ideal operational speed as part of that, is something that most people don't appreciate.
Bob, one thing I think we need to make sure we cover, so we'll go ahead and do it now, You've mentioned several times that they've changed the target and they've adjusted the times doing turning targets. I know I'm going to get 32 emails this week if we don't cover that. My understanding is that the current target that they're running is a straight up USPSA target. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct. And Mike had these targets custom printed, obviously, and as the department grew, the story I heard was they couldn't afford these custom targets anymore. And it was funny, it was just a local cardboard company out in Bakersfield that was printing them. I mean, that made cardboard boxes, and Mike went to him and said, "Hey, make these targets for me." And the one of the things I'm honored is the target behind me, the clear one, is one of the actual targets. Both Dwayne Thomas and Jim Ramos have some of the actual targets left over from Bakersfield, and the fact that they sent me a couple, I don't think I won't ever shoot them. They're just gonna sit, right? But yeah, so they use an IPSC target today. They use the A zone for 10 points, the C zone for 9 points, and the D zone for 6 points. So if you go back to Mike's original target, it was a 7-inch circle inside of a 10 by 13 oval. That 7-inch circle was 10 points. Anything in the oval was 9 points, and anything on the cardboard outside that oval was 6 points. So the IPSC target is pretty much doing the same thing. I wrote down, I don't have it in front of me, but I wrote down what their times are. Now they're using turning times. They're doing separate. So since most people don't have access to turning targets, I don't think I even mentioned it in the article, what the new times were. But again, they got rid of the quarter second. So just so all the listeners are clear, stage one is a 10 feet, 2 rounds, 1.5 seconds. Mike's scoring was, you got a 1 second penalty for every quarter second you went over. So just the other day, I shot that first stage in 1.76. So I got 2 points down. If I would have stayed at 0.7, well, I guess at 0.75, I still would have been 2. 1.74, I would have only been 1 point down. So for each quarter second over, yeah, and that's true of each of the 4 stages.
Yeah. I'd be curious to see, did they stay with, when they went to the turning, did they give the same additional time on each standard?
I think they did.
So like we're going to add a half second to each stage, or was it like did they adjust that depending on what the stage?
Yeah, I'll search my notes here real quick. Tyler Beeson, the current range master, was very kind, answered a lot of emails, talked to me a lot about what they're currently doing. I know, Wayne, you've been out there. I don't know if you know Tyler or not.
No, I don't.
He's our current range master, and he was thrilled to hear somebody was writing an article. The whole department was thrilled to hear that somebody was writing an article. Bakersfield, as you guys have mentioned, been tough. I heard there was a TV series about their police department for a while, but it didn't last more than maybe a year. It's a rough spot, as any place around oil fields are. Talked to Larry Mudgett, was another guy I talked to, obviously trying to get a sense of, had he had any interactions with Mike, any stuff between LA and PD and Bakersfield. Larry was obviously familiar with what Mike was doing, but said he couldn't really add a lot to what I already knew. But that was another great conversation as well. Larry's on my list to go take a class from. Hopefully he doesn't retire. People that I've met says he'll teach you about things about the trigger you never knew about.
Well, all of us except you have been there with him.
Yeah.
What was it,
I know
3 years ago, guys?
Yeah, it's getting close to 3.
Yeah.
September,
It was a hard 4 days.
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
4 days, and I fired 132 rounds.
I fired 123.
And was whipped at the end of those 100
every day.
I will say that was one of the best experiences that I've had in this whole thing of the training world that I've been in, just because of the whole immersion that we all had. It started at breakfast each morning. because all of us staying in that hotel together and going down and in the lobby, and like the education started when the eggs got served. And then we would go do the whole class, come back. We all went to dinner together. And then we went back to the hotel and sat around in the lobby for another hour or two, rehashing everything and talking about the whole thing was just a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful experience.
Yeah. It's a good week.
You know, I like the emphasis you guys put on. I think this is a test. I wouldn't call it a drill. It's a test. When I run it cold when I go to the range. And after I shoot it, I may wait another month or two before I shoot it again. Right. I think when I shoot it in my classes, we sit down and talk about it, about, hey, did you use the 4 seconds at 60 feet? Why didn't you? Now, some guys will get, maybe get lucky and get their 2 hits in the 7-inch circle, but I see more guys miss at that distance, and then their times are like 2.7. Well, okay, so you didn't use the 4. So, one of the hardest things I've found to teach shooters is to get a clock in their head so that when they're at different distances, they know what 4 seconds feels like, right? And they shoot at that pace or whatever number you want to throw out there. But I think in this conversation of accuracy and time, that might be a good conversation. Like, how do you teach shooters? You just ran a 1.5 seconds in a 2-second stage. Now you're out at 60. You're all set up in your mind for 1.5 and 2, but now you got 4. Use it. Let me throw that one out there for your comments.
Well, I think, and this is just anecdotal, I see so much more emphasis on the speed part from people. Like they'll run, like say it's somebody in an IDPA match,
Right.
they'll run through the course of fire or whatever the stage is, and they immediately will go ask the timer what their time was instead of going and looking at their targets and seeing what their points down were, and then going and seeing what their time is.
Right.
And sometimes you'll watch a video on YouTube or something like that, and you see somebody burn down a target array and nobody ever even sees where the shots hit. And you'll see comments, man, that's great shooting, whatever. No, it was fast shooting. We don't know if it was good or not. And we can't lose sight of, you got to get the hits. That's what matters. Now, obviously, speed is an element when it comes to shooting to save your life. But we have got to get the hits. Wayne, what is it your guys say is a series of 2-second gunfights?
It basically is, and I worked on and developed a little idea about the 2-second standards that, all of this stuff, all of this combat stuff, and it involves more than just shooting. It involves, physical combat. It involves sports. There's these little bunches of 1.5 and 2 and 2.5 second events that within them has a 1/4 or 1/2 second opportunities to either win or lose what you're after. And most of the time we don't pay attention to that. We'll sit there and say, okay, well, I got 5 seconds to do this. Well, we're going to give you 5 seconds, but somewhere in there is your opportunity, because if we start putting people in dynamic encounters, in urban areas where you've got people in the problem, you don't get to shoot the whole time and take shots, because there are circumstances and individuals and angles that say you can't shoot right now, and you got to be able to set it up and be ready for when it comes. And one other thing I was going to say is, and this is just for the future list, if we were going to do another couple of podcasts, one of them would be, we're missing the third leg of the triangle on speed versus accuracy. And the third leg of the triangle on that is assessment, because you have to have an awareness of what's going on in this event. And that is, am I doing well? Am I doing poorly? Do I need to do something different? Do I need to move? There's just do I need to stop shooting? That's the hardest one. And that's where I see people that are just really blazing it down. They're unable to stop shooting if the circumstances change, which means in the day of the body worn camera, you're going to document people shooting people after they've turned and run away or fallen out of the scene, etc. That's one problem. The other one is if we're going to have another podcast topic, and we've kind of danced all around it, and that is have a podcast topic on what really is qualified. We keep on throwing around various shooting courses and calling them qualifications, and they rarely are. What they are is a whole bunch of collection of marksmanship assessments, and that's about it, because they don't test much of anything else.
Well, that what is qualified is the age-old question, but man, you hit on it perfectly on speed, accuracy, and assessment. And if only there was someone on this panel right now that had a class that has that built into their class exercises. Maybe his name is Hearne.
Well, I
Yes,
think when
well,
you go ahead, John.
say, shameless plug. I've got one slot left in cognitive pistol in Ohio, and we will spend a tremendous amount of time having to make decisions on the fly. And one of the things that we do is make you learn how to stop shooting. And that, when the feedback I ran the class at Reedy's last time, I was like, that was the most important thing I got. I'm used to being able to just, burn it down with a bill drill. But when I ask you to interrupt that bill drill, all of a sudden the bill drill is no longer a bill drill. We'll just put it that way.
Absolutely right.
I think when we talk about speed, we've got to talk about decision making, because to me that's the boundary around speed. There's lots of people that can shoot fast. The problem is they're going to be shooting faster than their brain can make decisions. It's funny. One of the articles I wrote and submitted to get published that ended up getting turned down, I shared it with Tom, and he published it in the Range Master newsletter, and it was called "Shooting at the Speed of Decision Making." And Wayne, I talked to Daryl quite a bit about that article when I wrote it, with Daryl's help, walking through Daryl Bulkey's help on what I know about decision making from having taught it at kind of an executive level at the university, but then tying that into shooting, right? And I think that's the boundary around the discussion of speed, is the concept of how fast can you make decisions. For most human beings, that's a pretty solid time. Where that starts to get shorter is in the special forces community, because they go through lots of training to reduce that decision-making time, but it's intense training to do it. For most human beings, it's pretty solid.
Yeah.
And I look at split times a lot in my class and go up to guys and say, hey, you shot that at a split time that's really fast, but your brain can't think at that split time. So if all of a sudden that bad guy fell to the ground, most likely you would have fired 3 additional shots that weren't necessary, as your brain reacted to the fact that that person's now on the ground.
Yeah, we call those jailbait splits.
Yeah, or turn their back. So, one of the questions I get a lot from the community is just in the local area that I'm in. Concealed carriers come up to me all the time and say, how do I know I'm good enough? I'd like to say, get in a gunfight, we'll find out, but you can't do that. So I've kind of used the 5x5 a lot. Five shots in a 5-inch circle, 5 seconds at 5. I tell people, if you can do that, Claude Warner then adds, can you do that 5 times in a row? I think you got pretty good skills with your handgun. Now, there's as you talk about the other sides of the triangle, there's other skills you need to have besides marksmanship. But I think that would tell me that you run the gun well.
Yeah.
Now,
there's
just
a bunch of those.
Give you a quick example. I ran it this weekend in the class, and again, I run that as a test, not a drill. The guy got up there, shot it really nice, 3.6 seconds. And I went up there, pasted a new target up, and I said, okay, that was great. And record his draw time so you can see what all of his splits were. I said, now I want you to shoot this as close to 5 seconds as you can. And man, did he give me a weird look. And he did. Timer went off, he shot it. He slowed down, but his slow down was like 4.2. I went up there, put another target. I said, nope, I said, I don't care if you go over 5. Just, I want you to shoot it close to 5. My point is, this isn't about, you got to shoot it as quick as you can shoot it. Because when I showed him his split times, I said, your split times are quicker than you could be making the decisions with a gun in your hand. I'm not teaching that. This isn't about speed. I'm not teaching this to see how quick you can shoot it. If you shoot it at 4.9, I'm thrilled. If you can shoot it at 3.6, great. But if you can't slow yourself down or shift that gear to shoot it at 4.9 after you shot at 3.6, you're building some bad habits, in my opinion.
I'd say this is that you reach a point of diminishing returns with speed a lot sooner than you do accuracy. I've always, if you can hit an 8-inch circle in 1.5 seconds at 7 yards, don't try to take another quarter second off your draw time. Make the target smaller. You're going to get a lot more reward for being able to have a little more accuracy than you will speed. That's just the nature of the problems we're trying to solve in the real world.
Yeah, amen.
I'm struck by whether you watch the Lee Marvin edition or the Tom Selleck edition of Monty Walsh. There's that scene where Shorty goes galloping up on his horse, reins it to a hard sliding stop, and jumps off in this big, fancy, flashy move. And he turns around and looks at Monty and says, "Can you do that?" And Monty just kind of easily just steps off his horse. He says, "Yeah, I can. See, I just did it." He goes, "You didn't do it." He says, "You got off your horse. I got off my horse."
Well said.
Yeah. So, all right, we are roughly at an hour and a half at this point, so I guess it's time to start wrapping it up. Wayne, what you got upcoming?
Oh, wow. Well, I've got the Tom's trainer invite seminar in Nashville coming up this coming weekend. Weekend after that, I've got the Snub Revolver Summit with Daryl and Chuck and all the rest of us up there at Brian Eastridge, which is going to be a hot, humid time, but I think we're going to have a blast. So looking forward to all of that.
So I may get to see you 2 weekends in a row.
Boy, that would be a great life for you.
That would be. It would be. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to make the snub thing yet. We'll with range week coming up here in a couple, I'll make a decision after that. I'm going to see how well I can handle the shooting.
You should come up and just carry water for us, if nothing else.
that might need to be the service that I provide to the community is keeping you guys hydrated and keeping.
Yeah, no kidding. Would love to see you.
John, what you got?
I'm pretty much sold out for the rest of the year. I think I've got one slot in the August class up in Ohio for cognitive pistol with tactical anatomy. I'm also doing the defeating violent criminals lecture as part of that. I'm going to be out, I think, in Mead Hall. I've got to finalize this bill. I'm probably doing the same lecture out there, contemporaneous with Gelhaus's pistol instructor out there. I'm trying to get 2025 booked up and finalized. I hope to have that schedule, at least the first half, rolled out. But I'm busy. I'm moving, and the good news for me is, so far everything's mostly sold out as far as that stuff goes. So pay attention. I'm sure I'll be popping up on a podcast here or there. Wayne's throwing out some great ideas. So I don't think you officially Hearned me yet. By the way, that the earlier Hearning was offline, Lee. So I think you may have been remiss.
I'll make up for it. I'm going to see you in person this week, so it's gonna get to happen then. Bob, tell people how they can get in touch with you with your business and everything else and what you got coming up.
Well, I'm lucky that I just stay local with all my classes. I'm hoping John might invite me to his class when he's in Ohio. We can meet. I think he's not going to be too far away from me. One of the advantages I'll share with you about being just a local guy and being associated with a range is I don't have to worry. I don't have to put on full day classes. I think people learn a lot better when they're just in a short, like 2.5 hour class. So almost couple Saturdays a month, I'm doing a 2.5 hour class. These are for people that already have their concealed carry license, have been through a little bit longer class with me, learning how to shoot from concealment, learning how to shoot from a holster. And in that 2.5 hours, I can just focus on 1 or 2 things. And, they're going to remember a lot more from that class than, and I think, I know when you go on the road, you got to take advantage of a full day, but boy, I remember sitting in a lot of those classes and so much is getting shoved into you in a day that by the time I go home and get through a sleep cycle, I don't remember much of it. So I'm just going to stay with my 2.5 hour classes. They're called next level classes. I teach them at a local range. indoor range here in Cincinnati that the guy's kind enough to give me the range before the store opens up so we can run the class. It's one of the few indoor ranges that you can shoot from concealment. But that's just because we're doing a class. So yeah, if anybody wants to get a hold of me, get a hold of Lee. Lee's got my contact information. I've got a couple articles that I'm considering writing. One is going to be on start hand positions. I don't know if you guys have seen all the videos out now, but a lot of people, especially with the emphasis on time, kind of use hand positions that I guess some people call it a cheater position, or an Adam and Eve position is another one I've heard. Yeah, like, and you know, one of the guys that was in my class this weekend is sitting there with his hands down at his waist, right, with his fingers already on the edge of his garment. And I said, you do that on the street, and this is from all of our friend William April. You do that on the street, and a bad guy's going to shoot you because he knows why your hands are down there, because bad things come from that location. So listen, I don't mind you practicing down there every now and then, hands from the side. I shoot a lot with my hands here, but I think my next article is going to be on hand positions, starting positions. And, you know, you got to train yourself in 3 or 4 different hand start positions and not just be down there in that grab my shirt, I can't wait to get my 1 second draw, so that's where I've got to be kind of thing. Probably nobody will publish it, but I'll have a great time writing it.
Hey, Bob,
No.
I'll throw this out real quick. If you want
Yeah.
to screw with people, don't just change hands positions, make them change feet positions,
Oh, for sure.
because they don't get that nice linear recoil tracking or anything like that. Just shift your feet around and let's see how that bill drill works out for you now. Or
There
have
you
to
go.
turn 30 degrees. So, you know.
Don't give away my class from TACCON this coming year.
Hey,
Stop
I
it.
just want to say thanks, Lee. You know, this article was one of the most fun things I think I've done in a long time, in terms of just gathering information, putting together what I've learned personally from it, what I think the firearms industry, you guys that go out and do classes at a national level, influence a lot more people than I do. I think it's amazing that something that was developed in the early 70s is still as relevant today as it was back then, and can teach some amazing skills and create some amazing discussions in a classroom about shooting, again, accuracy and speeding, putting that all together. So I was honored. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I would argue that much of firearms training from the 1970s is still more relevant than what we see along today.
Absolutely.
Because I would say that original old school gun sight 250 is probably still the best bang for the buck out there.
And that's one on my bucket list too. Hopefully
I'm
next
talking
year.
about the old school, and I'm not knocking the new product by any means.
Yeah.
But even now, you go through that, or you went through it way back when. If you went back and practiced all that stuff and stayed current, that taught you pretty much everything you.
Yeah. And
I'm not saying
Lee's got some printouts available, PDF printouts on his website of the target. I'm going to send you the camo version. The one, John, that you put together, I think it has the 8-inch circle, correct?
Mine's a 6-inch circle because I'm
Okay,
just
so
a
if you want the
bughead
more
like that.
difficult version, download John's. Mine is the 7, and it's not quite in the center of that oval. What I learned is it sits a little bit higher in the oval. But yeah, 6 inches, go with John's version if you want a greater challenge. But I'll send you the camo ones. I just wanted people to know you print those out, and you can just glue them on a IPSC target or an IDPA target, and you basically have Mike's target.
Yeah, I've gotten away from buying pre-printed targets. I still do for some things that I got to have. Most of the stuff I've gone to is stuff I can just print out. Go to a local office supply store with a thumb drive and give me 50 of those, 50 of those, 50 of those.
Yeah, the downside, it's an 11 by 17 sheet of paper to get the oval. So I don't have that capability at home. I had to run up to FedEx to get them printed. But yeah. And if you use a white background, I'd really emphasize, don't make the lines too dark. It's not in keeping with how Mike developed that qualification. He wanted those lines hard to see, even at the first 10-foot stage. And out at 60, they're basically, you don't see them at all. You got to learn to work off the shoulders and the head of that target. And I think that's a good skill.
I guess we'll get to work in a Herning after all. You know, John has to have a truck to haul everything he needs to teach class, and I just take a thumb drive. And I learned something from Spalding. Yeah, when I hosted him the first time, he emailed me one of those little, excuse not emailed, actually mailed me one of those little, if it fits, it ships U.S. Postal Service boxes,
Yeah.
and I got it from the post office. And he said, make sure you have some IDPA or USPA targets for backers. Okay, I got those. And we met on the range. I handed him his box. He opened it up, and it was all his little printed targets and everything he uses for the class. I'm like, that is genius. And so I
Yes.
started, you know, because I have a custom target and everything that's printed by a company that's out there and all this stuff. I'm like, you know, if I just go to that plan, I don't have to have anything else. And so I've worked all of my courses over to stuff I can just print or either go to the office supply store and get done. Um, as far as what I've got coming up, I'm still in the rehab game from the most recent hand surgery. I will live fire probably for the first time next week. I think I rushed it on the previous hand surgery. So I'm waiting till range week next week, or unless I get somewhere this week to break it in and see where I'm at that way. I have a consult on a cataract surgery in first week of August, the consult. So I don't know when the actual surgery would be. So I'm holding off on scheduling a lot of stuff, but I'm still working on a bunch of stuff behind the scenes as far as some academic coursework um, that I want to do in conjunction with firearm stuff. And so just keep watching. I'll be getting some stuff out there. I've got a shotgun class scheduled on September the 21st in Cisco, Georgia, which is up near Dalton, which is near Chattanooga. And I'm anticipating being able to go forward with that class, but we'll see. But
Hey, Lee, you're welcome to put that article up on your website. I sent you the
okay,
PDF.
sure.
You're welcome, because I know not everybody's a subscriber to that magazine.
Okay.
But so
Thank
if
you.
anybody was listening tonight and like it, you're welcome to put that PDF of the article up
All right.
on the website to download it. It has
Sure.
obviously all the details about the qual and the target sizes and so on and
Sure.
so
I'll throw it
forth.
in the Bakersfield article
Yeah, yeah.
and put it up there with that and share it in the show group on Facebook. Uh, well, folks, I appreciate the contributions of everyone tonight. And I know that your most important asset is your time. Thank you for choosing to spend it with us. And they have moved all of the controls around in Zoom, so it's taking me an extra second to figure out how to stop it.